What if I told you the most important priest in the entire Bible appears in only 3 sentences, has no parents, no birth, no death, and somehow shows up in Jewish scripture, Christian theology, and ancient apocalyptic texts spanning over 1,000 years of history? His name is Melchizedek, and nobody agrees on who he actually was. Genesis 14 is a war chapter. Abraham has just routed a coalition of 4 kings to rescue his nephew Lot. He is riding back, victorious, and then out of nowhere, this figure steps into the narrative. No introduction, no backstory. He brings bread and wine, blesses Abraham, and disappears. 3 verses. That is the entire Genesis account. And in ancient Hebrew writing, that silence is deafening. Here is the thing you have to understand about ancient Hebrew literature. Genealogy was not optional. It was identity. It was legitimacy. When a figure appears in the Torah, you get their father, their tribe, their lineage. Think of how carefully Genesis tracks every name from Adam forward. That framework exists because in the ancient Near Eastern world, who you descended from determined who you were allowed to be. Melchizedek has none of that. No father, no mother, no birth record, no death record. He simply appears, and then he is gone. That alone would have stopped any Hebrew reader cold. But there is a second problem. He holds 2 titles simultaneously, King of Salem and Priest of God Most High. Under Mosaic law, those roles were strictly separated. Kings came from the tribe of Judah. Priests came from the tribe of Levi. You could not be both, except Melchizedek predates Moses by centuries, so he is operating outside a system that does not exist yet. He is a theological anomaly who existed before the rules were written. You will not find this one on a Sunday school poster. His name is not accidental. In Hebrew, Melchizedek is a compound word. Melech means king, Tzedek means righteousness, so his name literally translates to king of righteousness. And his city, Salem, is widely accepted by scholars, including those at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, to be the ancient name for Jerusalem. Salem and Shalom share the same root, peace. So you have the king of righteousness ruling from the city of peace. Thousands of years before Solomon builds the temple there, around 957 BC. That is not a minor detail. That is the same ground. Now here is what stopped me when I first really sat with this passage. Abraham, the founding patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, bows to this man and gives him a tithe, 10% of all his war spoils. In the ancient world, that gesture meant something specific. You only tithed to someone of higher spiritual authority. Abraham, the man God had just made a covenant with, is acknowledging that Melchizedek outranks him. That is an extraordinary claim, sitting quietly inside 3 verses that most people skim past. Genesis is written, centuries pass, and then around 1000 BC, the Psalms are being composed, and Psalm 110 verse 4 drops a line that must have landed like a stone in still water. God declares that a coming king will be, quote, a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. Jewish writers are still wrestling with this figure nearly 1,000 years after he appeared. That verse is theologically explosive because it implies a future leader will operate outside the Levitical priesthood, the priestly system established under Moses. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a challenge to the entire religious infrastructure of ancient Israel. But here is what I find genuinely fascinating. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 near Qumran, contain a document scholars call 11Q Melchizedek. It dates to around 100 BC, and it is an entire text dedicated to him. The Qumran community, which was a sect of Second Temple Judaism, meaning Jewish religious life, in the period between the rebuilding of the temple and its destruction in 70 AD, portrays Melchizedek as a heavenly, angelic figure who will execute divine judgment at the end of days. This is not a footnote. This is a community treating a 3-verse Genesis cameo as one of the most important figures in cosmic history. Fast forward to around 65 to 70 AD. The book of Hebrews is written, and it does something remarkable. It dedicates 3 full chapters to Melchizedek, chapters 5, 6, and 7. more space than most named apostles receive in the entire New Testament. The author zeroes in on exactly what we have been talking about: the silence, no parentage, no birth, no death. Hebrews 7 verse 3 states he was, quote, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. And the argument being made is precise. That silence is not an oversight. It is a theological portrait of an eternal priesthood. Now, who is the audience for this argument? Jewish Christians who believed the only legitimate priesthood ran through the tribe of Levi. The author of Hebrews is saying, look back before Levi was ever born. A valid priesthood already existed, which means the Levitical system is secondary, not supreme. That is a bold move. And it works because the evidence is already sitting in Genesis. What I find compelling here is that the argument does not rely on a new revelation. It relies on a detail everyone had already read and quietly walked past. The author of Hebrews is essentially saying, you already had the answer. You just did not stop long enough to ask the question. So, who was he? Theologians, historians, and religious traditions across 2,000 years have landed on 4 major theories, and none of them have won. The first is the most straightforward. He was a historical Canaanite king who genuinely worshipped the God of Abraham, a real man, a real city, a real encounter. The second is what biblical scholars call a Christophany, meaning a pre-incarnate physical appearance of a divine figure before the incarnation. This view holds that Melchizedek was not a man at all, but a divine manifestation. The third comes from early Jewish tradition. According to Hebrew chronology, Shem, the son of Noah, would still have been alive during Abraham's lifetime. Some rabbinical sources identify Melchizedek as Shem himself, a patriarch so ancient he bridged the world before and after the flood. The fourth is the Qumran view we already mentioned, an angelic being, a heavenly figure operating on earth. What makes this debate remarkable is that it crosses every religious line. Jewish rabbinical tradition, Catholic theology, Protestant scholarship, and certain latter-day saint doctrines all have distinct and mutually exclusive readings of the same 3 verses, one name. Thousands of years of disagreement. That is not a minor character. That is a fault line. I have spent a long time with this particular figure, and here is what I keep coming back to. Ancient Hebrew texts do not forget things accidentally. When a genealogy is missing, it is missing on purpose. When a death record is absent, that absence is doing work. The author of Genesis knew exactly how unusual it was to introduce a figure with no lineage in a book that is essentially one long genealogy. That choice was deliberate. The question is what it means. The author of Hebrews read that silence as a theological statement about eternity. The Qumran community read it as evidence of a heavenly being. Rabbinical tradition tried to solve it by attaching him to Shem, and Christian theologians have been using him to argue about the nature of priesthood for 2,000 years. What all of these readings share is the recognition that the silence itself is the text. Melchizedek does not need a backstory because the absence of a backstory is precisely what makes him theologically useful across every tradition that has ever tried to claim him. One verse, one name, so much to unpack. And honestly, that is what keeps pulling serious readers back to this passage. It is not that the Bible forgot to explain him. It is that the explanation might be the mystery itself. Melchizedek is not a mystery to be solved and moved past. He is a figure designed to make you stop. If you have ever read Genesis 14 and felt a quiet pull to go back and read it again, that instinct was correct. The text rewards the pause. The Bible remembered him. History mostly forgot him. And that gap is exactly where the most interesting questions live. If this kind of deep reading is what you are here for, subscribe and stay close. There are more figures like this one waiting. Names you have read a dozen times and never fully stopped for.